So from Mutanui to Maxilos, today we're going to be talking about Bionicle Titan mocks. You might ask, what is a Titan mock? Well, the term Titan is kind of a classification you could give to any Bionicle set or mock that is much larger than your traditional Toa. Basically any of the larger sets like Mutanui, Maxilos, Hydraxon, Gdunka, any of those sorts of characters, they were much larger, whether that's that they were just taller or just had a lot more pieces in them, or just in some way big. That's what made them a Titan, and we're going to talk about Titan mocks today. We're going to explore certain things that make a Titan mock good, stuff that you could explore if you were working on a Titan mock yourself, stuff to consider, all that sort of stuff, and possibly just taking a look at some different Titan mocks you might get inspired along the way. So let's begin with the first Titan mock that we've got here, and this is by Ronald Igaitis, and this is called Rohku the Gatekeeper. I love the fact that this guy uses the Umarak headpiece, or a slightly modified version of it instead, but puts that on the head here. It actually works surprisingly well, giving this character this funky looking kind of head crown almost. It's really neat. And also the fact that this axe here kind of has little shades of Axon's axe, as in the set Axon that had a really noticeable and really cool axe. I like the fact that this set is using certain things that you saw in sets, but expanding on them in some way, or only maybe slightly changing them. And the reason I like that is because you don't always have to reinvent the wheel. If you think Axon's axe was really good, you don't have to completely redesign this amazing new, totally different axe. Why not just use it, or put some slight modifications on it in some way and put it on your mock? If a set did something well, there's no distinct rules saying that you can't copy it and can't use it yourself. Give it a go and put it on your mock. It might work really well, like it does here. And honestly, if you were to say to me like, hey, what if I put some Umarak the Hunter, like reindeer horns on top of my Toa Titan guy? That would look cool, wouldn't it? Probably in my head I might be like, no, that wouldn't look cool, but this mock has very much proven me wrong, and I love that. So that's another thing too, is just experiment. You never know what might work. You might be making this more sort of interesting character that fits in with your unique backstory and your interesting Bionicle storyline, and you might want to create this funky new race that has antlers on their head, or that has some super cool like wing adaptation, or abnormally large feet, or something, who knows? Play around with it, see what works, and like we see here, it works really well. Same thing I think goes for the color scheme on this mock. I kind of go, like white, black, silver, dark red, there's so many colors being used. Again, logically in my head, if I were to see it written on paper, I'd go like, maybe that's too much. But I don't know, seeing it here, I think it works. It kind of adds to the flair that this character has, this super large, tall dude with antlers on his head, and he's all these different colors. He's got a big old axe and a robot arm. He's kind of just this beautiful mishmash of multiple different things, and just together they work so well. And I think, again, like I was saying before, this mock as a whole is a beautiful example of just really experimenting and playing, because, like I was saying before, something on paper could seem like a bad idea, but it's not until you try it that you realize, hey, it's actually pretty good. And honestly, that's a lot of my building process with whatever I'm building, is I'm like, oh, that's a cool idea. Do you think that'll work? I don't know, give it a go. And then often it does. Or sometimes you're like, cool idea, but no, it didn't work. But then it becomes a springboard into something else that you go, okay, well, this thing initially didn't work, but it made me think of this, which did work and was an even better idea. So start playing around with that sort of stuff. See what you can do, see what you learn. I also mentioned before, he's got this cool robot arm. I love the asymmetry here. Always nice to add a bit of asymmetry. Maybe you've built one arm for a Bionicle and you want to build the second one, but you're like, I don't have those pieces to duplicate that again. There's no reason he couldn't have a robot arm or an asymmetrical arm that is of different design. Nothing wrong with that at all. I love too the masks on the shoulders here. The fact that one is the Vakama mask and one is the Axon mask there. That's kind of again more beauty in that asymmetry. But also just masks as shoulders has always been a beautiful thing, and this is a great example of how nice that can look. Also, I'll just point this out here because I'm probably going to talk about it a lot during this episode. This mock has pistons on the leg here. Typically when you make a Titan, something to always consider is the fact that they need to be able to support themselves. Titans are much larger and often probably use more pieces and might even have kind of more going on the top half of the mock, and it can make it a bit top heavy, more likely that it'll fall, or it just won't be able to support its own weight, that sort of stuff. Adding in pistons is a great way to be able to have it support itself a bit more. The official sets did that as well. And simply the way to attach a piston is to just put the bottom of it on some part of maybe the lower leg, and then put the top half on some bit on the upper leg. Basically, any area, if you're able to pinpoint on the mock that needs a little extra support, put a piston linking that area to another area on the mock, and it should be able to help it a lot. Again, experiment and play. maybe rework certain designs or just find different areas that the piston might work, and you'll hopefully be able to eliminate some of those issues of it not being able to support its own weight. So it's a fantastic mock. Let's move on to the next one. This one is called Toa Mycalix, and this is by Galdiator. Some interesting stuff going on here on the lower legs on this mock, really layering in a whole bunch of system here. Kind of looks like this really strong and sturdy armor design, and when I originally saw this, I don't think it necessarily is the case, but I almost saw this as kind of like a sort of suit of armor around a sort of maybe smaller Toa-sized mock, or some sort of mechanical adaptations that made him this much larger, towering kind of suit of armor or something like that. You know, some certain aspects of like Iron Man or maybe Darth Vader or something like that in terms of how the machine aspects or the armor kind of influences the design of the body there. And I really like that. And I think having that much larger, more pronounced, prominent sense of system there on the bottom and how large and in charge and dense that looks kind of helps to convey that. Whether or not that's the original purpose behind this or not, that's at least what I'm seeing, and I kind of like that. I think it's pretty cool. And I think the same can be said for the rest of the mock as well. A whole bunch of different Bionicle pieces being used on the top there to kind of form this, really strong and sturdy armor, big shoulders, really strong looking kind of chest design there. With lots of armor protecting him, which is what I was thinking and how it looked very kind of like an exosuit, or kind of like the Exotoa, like that fantastic Bionicle set. So that's always something you could possibly consider, is doing that, designing some sort of exosuit for an already existing Toa that you might have, so that you take a sort of smaller scale mock and make it much larger by simply giving it a suit of armor or something, so that maybe you could even have a little tiny itty bitty Matoran who has this giant suit of armor that makes him super large and in charge and powerful. That could be cool. Also good to see a bunch of weapons being used here, different silver weapon pieces, because I'm sure like me, you have a lot of them lying around that you just haven't used, and that's always something that's great about building a Titan, is you are able to put in a whole bunch of different larger pieces on them because they are naturally much larger, so it's time to use those large pieces that you might not otherwise use on smaller scale Toa-sized mocks. And speaking of focusing on size of pieces, I think this is a really smart mask choice for a Titan. Obviously, like I said, typically Titans are much larger, and there are certain masks. For example, Onoa G2's mask is a very, very small mask, and can be a little bit more difficult to use because of it. So maybe using one on a Titan isn't necessarily the best thing, which is very ironic because G2 Onoa was one of the largest sets, wasn't he? That's funny. Besides the point, though, certain masks, of course, are a lot smaller and wouldn't work on a Titan, whereas I think this Hully Murray mask here is actually a really decently large-sized mask to some degree and would work better on a larger scale mock. And some of the Toa Nuva masks are also quite large in size, so pay attention to the mask that you use on a Titan, because I would definitely recommend using masks that are just a bit more kind of thicker or larger. It would certainly be beneficial in having everything seem more in proportion. Yeah, fantastic mock here, and even though maybe the exosuit design isn't exactly what you were aiming for, I think this mock has this really cool kind of armored look to it that is making me think of cool things, so I like it. This next mock is by Leo Doom, and is called Sharkface. Now, apparently the backstory on this mock is that he is a genetically engineered land shark with a technologically advanced exosuit. So this mock is an exosuit. Super cool. I love the mask choice, the kind of combination here that he's used here. Obviously, using that... Oh, goodness. What's that set's name? Jawblade, was it? Yes, Jawblade. Using that Jawblade head there, and then combining it with the Evoki, the Takanuva mask like that. That works so well. It very much looks like that Evoki is these super large and in-charge teeth that very much naturally fits a shark, and it very, very nicely complements that Jawblade mask like that. So the idea that he's making a shark that was genetically engineered and stuff like that, perfect. And what a beautiful mask combo. And also just the way that those teeth kind of protrude very far up onto or quite far towards the nose of the shark face there. It gives this mock a lot of character and a lot of personality, and I love that. Kind of makes him look like this really strong, powerful, brute-like character, but maybe he's not too smart, and that's not meant as an insult, it's just the sort of character trope that this mock at least is playing in my mind. And so I love that. It's so cool how much that mask is actually communicating. One thing that I don't know if it was a deliberate choice or not, but I think it actually says quite a lot. Taking a look at the upper legs here, he's used two sort of like digger claw pieces that have these caution symbols on them. And we were saying that this is an exosuit, so having in those little sticker additions like that is fitting in kind of communicating that this is a more mechanical-based exosuit. I like that. But the other thing I like so much is the fact that these are actually digger kind of scoop-like pieces. It implies a sense of like heavy machinery, because you'd probably see that sort of stuff on some sort of large construction digger kind of thing. And like I was saying before, this character does have this beautiful aesthetic of seeming very strong and powerful, and typically construction vehicles like that are very strong and powerful as well. And so I think that's really clever, deliberate choices in picking the parts that you used, because those pieces already kind of have a bit of a history behind them or communicate something about, you know, their original purpose. And so putting them on here kind of helps to communicate that even more, that this character is strong and powerful. And, you know, even the aspect of introducing those caution stickers as well kind of implies a little bit of like a, whoa, be cautious of this character because he could rip your face off and eat it, you know. And I love that. Again, like I said, probably not a deliberate choice, but it's still actually communicating something, which is awesome. I also love the big menacing fingers on this character here, kind of almost like claw-like. Again, it's adding even more to this beautiful, brooding character that's being conveyed here. The other thing I love too is how this guy kind of, I wouldn't say it's a transformation, but he does sort of have this photo here where he sort of leans over, and then this big old Gatling gun and this other sort of blaster here kind of come off of his back, and it seems like this awesome kind of battle pose that he has. I love that. That's super cool. And it's a great way to kind of highlight those weapons even more. And it just sort of seems like something he'd do as a character. I think it's cool. And that's another thing we've spoken about, how Titans, something you really need to factor in with them is how they can be a little top heavy. Well, maybe that's something to consider, is if your Titan is having trouble standing up, do they even need to be standing up? Like this, maybe they could have another mode where they do sort of lean over. Or maybe your humanoid Titan could actually become a four-legged animal or something like that if you're just having a lot of trouble having it stand up on two legs. Could be another option. It could just be the way that the build is telling you to go. It's not a deliberate choice on your behalf, but you go, you know what? I'm going to just roll with this. Let's see where we can take it. I love, too, the way that the hero core in the middle here is kind of, it's got some armor over the top of it. It very much does look like that's sort of the under kind of original body of the shark aspect, and then the sort of gunmetal armor that's over the top of that Hero Factory core is kind of the additional exosuit that's being put on top of him. So some really nice layering there that's kind of communicating aspects of that backstory. On to the next mock here. This is by Eclipse Caller and is called Seltiast, Goddess of Inspiration. Ah, perfect for the show. I guess this is our pseudo-mascot now. Probably not. I guess Cossy's the pseudo-mascot. Anyway, it's still cool to have a Goddess of Inspiration on this show all about inspiration. Very fitting. So when I picked this, I kind of realized maybe it's not a Titan. I looked at it a bit more and I'm like, oh, it's not actually that large. But you kind of introduce a few other aspects on this, and more as we talk about it, you could kind of argue that it's a Titan. But also there's some things I wanted to talk about on this mock that you could very easily apply to a Titan. So the leg design on this, just kind of layering up all of those different trans blue Hero Factory bones, kind of almost looks like she's made of water, and she's kind of just using the water around her to kind of form legs. Like she's kind of emerging out of a pool or a lake or something like that, and this kind of column of water is just becoming some type of leg design there. I really like how that looks aesthetically, and that's something I've had the struggle with that in the past on building a Bionicle mock, and I know other people have as well, where you build this awesome torso, these brilliant arms, this great head, and then you get to the legs and you have no idea what to do with them. Well, this could be an interesting option here, is you do something like that. You get a kind of mesh of Hero Factory bones in different colors or trans colors like this, and you just kind of form some sort of elemental sort of spur of energy or spout of water or something, and that can just kind of become the legs. And also with that too, you probably have a huge amount of Hero Factory bones lying around. I know I do, I'm sure Eclipse Caller did as well, and you might as well. And so that way you can just sort of pour in a bunch of pieces here onto the leg design and make them very large. So like this, you could have a mock that is naturally quite small, but doing a leg design like this allows you to have them be massive and large. And yes, you are using a lot of pieces, but pieces that you already had lying around in large quantities anyway. It's an interesting option. and one that works really well here and fits in with the element that I imagine is more water-based. This mock has a very extensive backstory, and Eclipse Caller loves to go into his backstory in a lot of depth and detail, and if that's your jam and you like reading that sort of stuff, definitely head on over to his pages and read up on all of that stuff. I'm sure it's very fascinating to read, but my apologies, I have not read anything about it, but I at least see a very cool kind of water deity with this mock here. And then using these trans blue tentacle pieces here kind of coming out of the back as well. Just because naturally those are quite large, you could argue that that helps it be more Titan-like, just because it does very much increase the overall size of this mock. But little details like that, just introducing a few other pieces here to kind of make it look like water is just sort of oozing out of this mock, or energy is seeping into or out of it or something like that. It's a really, really fun, awesome detail that you could easily do something very similar to that on one of your mocks. Maybe you've got a tower of water that is very strong with their powers, and they have this water sort of emanating out of them like that. It's a really cool design, and could work really well on a Titan, of course. Another thing as well, I think both trans blue as well as this glow-in-the-dark blue, that we see some of these pieces here, and it's basically a fan favorite of the Bionicle Inspiration series, is seeing a bunch of these glow-in-the-dark, or the blue glow-in-the-dark pieces that came on, like Gadunka, Nocturne, Tachodox or Taradox. I know I mispronounced that a few episodes back. That's just how I said it as a kid, and I'm stuck with saying it now. Besides the point, though, those sets come with a good amount of pieces in that color. So, it's only about 3 or 4 different sets that come with that color of part. So if you own one or multiple copies of those sets, you already have a fair good amount of them. And of course, as you're building a Titan, obviously they're much larger. They can often require more pieces as well. So it's nice that if you do have those sets, you probably already have a decent amount of pieces in those colors, and you could easily put it into building a much larger mock like this. Because obviously, if you're building a larger mock, you need to factor in that you'll need a fair few amount more pieces. And I think that building with some trans blues and different kinds of blues and things like that would definitely be a color to consider. Because, like I was saying, you probably have a good amount of them if you've bought these sets, or if you have any kind of blue set that had trans blue or these pieces in them. But yeah, a fantastic mock and some cool concepts being explored on this one. On to the next one. This is by Luna Still, and the mock is called Astral Legionis. So this mock uses the Bionicle frame. If you watch the Frames episode of the Bionicle Inspiration series, we went into a good amount of detail on the Bionicle frame. So essentially it's a frame from the Instagram called Bionicle, and it's a frame that has instructions as well, and it's a really, really awesome, sturdy, great frame that you could build yourself and then armor up. And of course it is a much larger frame, as we see here, a more of a Titan-style frame. So if you are a little bit stuck on how to build the frame, or kind of the sizing, or you just need a good sort of starting point for your Titan mock, maybe build the Bionicle frame, and then you've got most of your job done there for you. You can just find individual ways of armoring it up, adding some detail to it, and you get a mock much like this. And this mock as well has a beautiful, beautiful color scheme, using the azure parts from Gully, some gold and some black. It just looks really nice. And I also think it's interesting to note that some of the other Bionicle mocks that we've seen on various other Inspiration episodes, most of the time the leg designs for Bionicle frames have used different masks. So we see a rocker mask being used here. We can see a black Huna, a black Huna Vakama's mask there, also being used on the legs. And if you're like me, you have a whole bunch of different masks lying around, and masks can obviously work very well as masks, but they can also work very well as armor. And as we see here, a Bionicle frame seems to be really lending itself to using those masks as kind of aspects of armor. So that's another thing to consider. And I know a bunch of people have always said, oh, how else could I use my masks? There's a way, and it involves a good old Bionicle frame. So yeah, Luna Still's done a fantastic job here. Love the color scheme, and really cool to see more people playing around with this Bionicle frame. I think it's a fun little trend, and I think it's a really fun, great way, kind of a great stimulus to starting a mock. And an even more perfect stimulus for building a Titan mock as well. This next mock is by Of Ruin and Glory and is called Atura. So we see another use of the Evoki, the Takanuva mask here. This time this is the sparkly, speckly Evoki, the more Mask of Light Evoki, as it were. And flipping it here and putting it on the head design like that kind of almost seems like it's this really interesting kind of tooth-like design, or kind of just these really strong, sharp angles. And with a more sort of sinister-looking mock like this, I think it's really fitting. As well as some of the other additions to the head here that also kind of look like more kind of claws or teeth or some sort of spikes or something like that. I think it's a really, really nice sort of texture play and different shapes and lines that are being formed here that help to communicate that more sort of sinister look behind this mark. Also, we see the color scheme of this mark is primarily black and silver, and kind of what I was saying before about using sort of trans blues and those glow-in-the-dark blue pieces. Using black and silver on a Titan mark is definitely a good idea, because I can speak from experience that both myself and a lot of other people I know, black and silver are probably the two most common colors in their collection. I'm currently looking at about 3 bins of them, and then I compare it to like my yellows or blues. They pale in comparison to the amount of grays and blacks that I have. So definitely maybe play around with black or silver in the color scheme of a Titan that you're making, because you probably will just naturally have larger amounts of them, because those colors are just way more common from Bionicle sets and pieces. So like I said, Titan mark's much larger. Having a larger amount of those parts will definitely serve you well. I also like the trans red details on this, and the fact that those trans red pieces are mainly Bohrok eyes here, and the fact that a trans orange Bohrok eye is used there on the head. You could make the argument of like, oh, well, is that a little bit confusing? Does it look like there's other eyes on this mark? But I would say it doesn't, because I think the simple addition of it being orange instead of red really helps to communicate that they are vastly different things. So that's always something to factor in, is, slight color changes. What can it communicate? But another fantastic mark. But on to the next one by Dave Foreman, and this is called Grottle Panopticon. So most of the Titans we've talked about before have been humanoids. Why do you need to do a humanoid? Why not do a fantastic, crazy mech thing like this, with all these goofy long arms and legs and stuff like that? I love it. It kind of reminds me of some sort of B-movie alien mech monster thing, or something you might see out of like a villain on Power Rangers or Doctor Who or something crazy like that. I really like it. And I'm always a person that loves the sort of more odd and obscure characters. It's why I like Star Wars so much, because they're everywhere. And that's definitely something you could do, is take inspiration from weird, crazy sci-fi movies or books or television series or whatever, and make a funky, crazy character with it. One that's really unique and has a lot of personality. And again, this mock uses a lot of larger pieces as well, and I think that's always something to factor in as well, is you probably have a lot of really large, obscure pieces that came in certain LEGO sets that you just never use. And I think this mock is a great example, because it uses those pieces and then uses it in a cool way. So instead of those pieces sitting in a bin and doing nothing, you actually put them to good use. For example, these big orange tubes came on some Mars mission sets, and I have them. I've done nothing with them, but maybe it's time I do something with them like Dave's done here. All these very large orange windshield pieces. They're so large they can be difficult to use, but on a mock like this, they're used well. And I'm sure you have that lying around too. Maybe you've got a bin filled with different wheels, or just these large chunky like burp pieces, or all sorts of craziness. Maybe you could find an interesting kind of mock like this that you could put them in. I also love the fact that this is a Titan mock that has a little itty bitty rider inside of it. This cute little lime dude who pilots it. That's super cool. I love the idea of a mech suit for a very small character like this, making him even more menacing and scary. And you have certain LEGO sets, like the Rex Celsior or the Hogwarts Castle, the big expensive one, and they have the little nano figures inside them, so that the interior is more micro scale, so you can kind of pack in lots of details there. Well, maybe that's something you could do yourself, is make this large, huge mech, but then have little minifigures or micro figures or nano figures inside it, whatever, and they can be piloting this huge thing, but obviously to the scale that it's at, it's even larger. Maybe that's something you could consider, and it'd be a fun way of packing in lots of details. Another great detail on this mock that's kind of obscured by the photography, but I imagine that's a deliberate choice on Dave's behalf, which is a cool thing to do. It has some trans-clear Technic beams holding it up, which, could be a little bit more difficult for this mock to support itself, just with the way that it's been designed. But there's nothing wrong with that at all. If your Titan needs a little bit of support, whether that's through some trans-clear pieces or just a black stand or something, there's nothing wrong with doing so. More than welcome to. On to the next mock. This is by Andrew L. and is called Toa Uriel. So this is another example of a very well-armored Toa that almost kind of looks like another kind of mech suit, which is kind of what I saw before. That's always something too that I quite like, is mocks that are very similar, have very similar concepts, similar color schemes, that sort of stuff, but they're done in very different ways. And whenever I'm prepping for a mock, prepping for something that I want to build, I do a lot of research beforehand. I see, I Google things, or I look stuff up on Flickr or mock pages or whatever that are very similar to what I've built. And then I see, okay, here's what they did, and here's what these guys did, here's what they did that was similar, here's what they did that was different. Now, how can I with what I've now learnt from looking at this stuff, what can I do to adapt what they've done, or how can I advance what they've done, or what haven't they done that I'd like to do? And then what can I do that's entirely different, all that sort of stuff. What can you learn from doing a little bit of research on similar concepts to what you're making? And doing research is always a good thing to do, you know? It may not always be the most interesting thing, because sometimes you just want to get building. You don't want to sit around and think about it. But sometimes a little bit of that is always helpful. So I always think it's cool to see that. Things that are similar, what can you learn from it? Again, I like seeing a lot of these larger pieces here, like these funky kind of grey shield pieces they use on the torso, the arms, the legs. There's a lot of nice visual unity in that, having similar textures and parts so that everything flows together nicely. I also love the printed shield piece on the torso here. It's a very nice, fun little detail there and adds a little bit more character to the mock. And also this beautiful belt that he's got here with these krana hanging off of it. Kind of looks like he's got some sort of cool collection of bad guys that he's slain, and he has them as trophies hanging around his belt. It's pretty cool. I like that little detail. So yeah, super, super cool mock here. On to the final one in this awesome, a little bit longer Titan episode. This is Lord Tyraximus by Andrew Steele. Now, I love the custom cloth that this guy has here. Really beautiful detailing all along it. I imagine he's just gone to a sort of, some sort of cloth store and bought this really interesting ornate looking cloth and cut it up in a certain way that it looks like this beautiful cloak over this guy here. Of course, this is not an official Lego piece, but it still looks great. And this cloth says so much about this character. It looks like a very rich, expensive kind of cloth. It looks like he's a little bit more royal and powerful. And, the fact that his name almost sort of says tyrant in it. It looks like he is this sort of wealthy dictator tyrant character. And even just the posing that he's in and as well, like he kind of reminds me of the Emperor from Star Wars, kind of having more lavish clothing at times and this cane kind of pretending that he's a little bit more weak, or actually maybe even being a little bit weak, but also being exceedingly powerful at the same time, very rich, having a lot of influence, that sort of stuff. A lot that's being conveyed just in the cloth. The cane as well, I briefly spoke about that. That's a fun detail. I don't imagine this mock has difficulty supporting itself, but if you built a Titan that does, maybe you could give them a cane or something that can kind of act as like a tripod or something, so that if the two legs aren't supporting itself, he has the cane to actually literally support himself as, a function of the character, but also so that the mock can literally support itself, and that cane kind of almost becomes a third leg there. It's a fun detail that works in multiple ways. It's cool. I also love the head design, how it kind of has this grayed effect, kind of like maybe a more robotic style head, or just kind of like a decaying, diseased part of himself that he's a little bit sick, or he's had some problems or something. And I don't know, that's just a really fun character trait, and it's some beautiful asymmetry on this mock. And I love the fact that he has another head on the torso as well. Really unique character design there. Just looks awesome. Now, a lot of this mock is made up of kind of flex tube and Exoforce robot arms being used to create this beautiful kind of curved, organic shaping to this character. It's really, really cool. And it's something you yourself could easily do. I've seen them on pick-a-brick walls occasionally, those Exoforce robot arm pieces there that are being used here. You get them in some quantities on Bricklink, or get them off the pick-a-brick wall, whatever, and kind of bulk them up and use them to kind of form the bulk of the limbs, or even the torso, or wherever on a mock. Or you do like this mock and you use some really interesting cloth and you can kind of cover up some areas, and you don't detail them too much, but the cloth obscures it. So it's a fun little trick there to make it seem like you've done a little bit more, when in reality you don't need to, because you can't even see it. But a beautiful mock and a bunch of beautiful Titans in this awesome episode today. If you enjoyed the episode today, you can submit some of your own stuff to the show. You can do so through the email you're currently seeing on the screen. Just send me some pictures and any other information you want to include, and one day it'll be featured on the show. Also, be sure to check the links in the description to the mocks that you saw in today's episode. Check out some of the other stuff they've done. They're talented builders. And while you're there, you can also see the links to some of my social media. Be sure to check that out if you so please. Otherwise, that's it. Happy building. Bye for now.